10 seconds, okay? Yeah.
10. Margaret, we got 10 seconds.
10 seconds.
I'll make it 12.
Yeah, 8.
Okay, and so I'm going to go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Bronwen, Maddox, Director of the Institute for Government, and this is the beginning of our one-day conference on government reform, why change is necessary and what needs to be done. There are people offering quite a lot of answers to that this morning in the political sphere, but these are our answers, which are, in fact, it seems to us, though we're not going to touch on it, very relevant to the kind of discussion going on at the moment all over the news. And this conference, we spent quite a lot of time, in fact, you might say years, in fact, you could say the whole history of the Institute in planning, but it is pegged to reports we brought out earlier this year under the leadership of Alex Thomas, who heads our civil service programme, and one is a new statutory role for the civil service, and one is better policy making. And I'm conscious I'm holding up these printed reports for, particularly for an online audience. It might seem very retro, but we went to the trouble of printing these out, which we wouldn't normally these days, to say, look, we really mean it, and we want these things to last. Well, we're going to divide the day into two, and the first half is looking at this role and the statutory role that we're recommending for the civil service and the lines of authority and responsibility. Then this afternoon is about policy making, where Tom Sass, one of our terrific team, is going to take us into that policy making paper. I've got a wonderful panel here to discuss it. Margaret Hodge, who has been Labour MP for Barking since 1994, I think, and was chairman of the Public Accounts Committee for an exceptionally lively 5 years. Ian Cheshire, many, many distinguished business roles, also the government's former lead non-exec. And Jonathan Jones, QC, who was former head of the government legal department, now legal consultant. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Before we get stuck in, and before, indeed, Alex takes us into the detail of his presentation, I'm now going to hand over to our chairman, David Sainsbury, who wanted to say some words about why this one really matters to us. David, good morning.
Good morning, Bronwen. Thank you very much. I think in my life, I've, on a number of occasions, had to make speeches in less than ideal conditions. But I think none as bad as talking about the long-term reform of the civil service while the government is actually sort of imploding just around the corner. I think actually the worst occasion was when a few years ago, when I was chairman of Sainsbury's, I went to get an honorary degree at Cranfield University. And before it, the Vice-Chancellor said, would you give a speech before the honorary degree ceremony? I said, of course. And went up there, and I discovered the other person getting an honorary degree was Neil Armstrong, the astronaut. And I came to my turn for my speech, and the Vice-Chancellor said, we're really excited to have two excellent speakers today. Neil Armstrong, who will talk about what it is to walk on the moon, and David Sainsbury, who will talk about the future of the supermarket industry. And when you've been through that experience, talking about the long-term reform of the civil servants is really quite easy. As chairman of the Institute, in the normal course of events, I leave it to the director to chair and speak at conferences of the Institute. But on this occasion, I decided I want to speak in order to stress how important the two reports we're discussing today are for the reform of the civil service, and to say why they will form the central part of the work of the Institute for the next 2 years. During the 8 years I was a junior minister in the then DTI, I learnt two lessons. The first is that civil servants in the department were very similar in terms of motivation and hard work to the managers I had worked with in industry. And I don't think I ever came across an example of civil servants trying to thwart the wishes of ministers. Blaming the civil servants for the failures of government is therefore, I think, both rather infantile and unproductive. But I also came to the view over the 8 years that I was in government that the lives of both ministers and civil servants were often frustrating and dispiriting because the system we were being asked to operate was dysfunctional. There appeared to be two reasons for this. Firstly, the lines of accountability between ministers and civil servants were unclear, and there appeared to be no one with the authority to manage the civil service. And secondly, there were in the DTI very few civil servants who had any expertise in the policy areas on which they were advising ministers. I early on decided if I was going to have an impact on the science and innovation policy, I would myself need to learn about how it worked in the UK and what was the experience of other countries. So when I set up the IfG in June 2009 with the task of redesigning the machinery of government to meet the challenges of the 21st century, I gave 4 examples of the sort of systemic problems that I thought the Institute should tackle. The first was the lack of clarity about what is the responsibility of ministers and what is the responsibility of civil servants. The constitutional position seemed to be that everything that happened in a department was the responsibility of the minister, other than the accounting officer role of the permanent secretary. Though no one believes that ministers have the time, or in most cases the knowledge and experience, to manage their departments. The result is that permanent secretaries are not held accountable for things they should be, and ministers are blamed for things for which they cannot reasonably be held accountable. It is just very important to understand that most ministers have no experience of running a large organization when they become the minister. I remember Stephen Byers, who was one of the ministers in the Department of Trade and Industry, when I was there, saying, David, it is just very difficult to know how to run this organization, because all my experience so far has been running my constituency office, which has 3 people, one of which is my wife, and this is no way to learn how to run a large organization. A systemic problem was the lack of anyone with the constitutional responsibility for running the civil service. I had naively thought when I became minister that the head of the civil service was like the CEO of a company and had the responsibility and authority for managing the civil service. But I gradually realized that constitutionally the head of the civil service has no authority over permanent secretaries. He is therefore more like the senior partner of a law firm who is responsible for ethics, who has which office, and the Christmas party, than the CEO of a company who is responsible for the efficient management of the organization for which he is head. And the reason that the activities of government often appear not to be joined up is that it's not the job of anyone to join it up. A third systemic problem that I thought the Institute should tackle was civil servants' lack of knowledge about the policy areas about which they advised ministers. When I became Minister for Science and Innovation, there was quite clearly a crisis in science policy, which had led to an organization called Save British Science being set up. But none of my civil servants could tell me what was going wrong or what I should do about it, and it was clear that I'd have to find out these things for myself. When, after leaving government, I set up the Institute, I therefore suggested that it should look at the issue of poor policymaking, though at the time I had no clear idea why it was so poor. Finally, while various tasks have been delegated to a large range of different arm's-length bodies, neither ministers or civil servants seem to be clear in each individual case who was responsible for what. And this was something that clearly needed to be fixed. Looking back 10 years after the Institute was set up, I think we've made some progress in reforming these issues, but not as much as I would have liked. For example, we've convinced the leadership, I think, of the civil service of the importance of functional leadership. Functional leadership being the basic business idea that in multi-divisional organizations, it's essential to have at the center of the organization technical experts in areas such as accounting, IT, and human resources, who set down the technical standards that all divisions should follow and advise on overall policies for the organization. And today, in all three areas, there are technical experts at the center of government, but fairly predictably, it's not totally clear what authority they have to lay down the necessary standards or see that they're properly implemented. I should say, only a few years ago, there were questions about financial reporting across government, and John Bronwen and I went to the Treasury and said, look, there seems to be poor financial accounting in departments. What are you going to do about it? And the Treasury said, the way that accounting is done across the civil service is no responsibility of ours. They should do it as they wish. And if you know anything about accounting, you know that actually that results in an extremely inefficient and poor way of controlling costs. The Institute has also clarified, I think, the reason for poor policy-making record of government is the constant movement of civil servants between jobs within departments, and that the reason for this constant movement is the incentives they're given. If you tell people that they can only get a salary increase if they move jobs, and that a key criteria for judging their performance and suitability for promotion is breadth of experience, not performance in their jobs, you should not be surprised if there's a lot of movement of people between jobs. The Institute has also done some useful work clarifying the relationship between ministers and different types of arm's-length bodies. But in the key areas of accountability of ministers and civil servants and the quality of policy making, we've not made as much progress as I would have liked to have seen. It may seem that these issues I'm talking about are boring and administrative and constitutional issues, which ministers and MPs should not have to think about. So let me say why they're extremely important if we are to improve the way the country is governed. When finally the review of the government's performance during the pandemic is done, I think it will emerge clearly that the government was ill-prepared to deal with it. And quite rightly, people will want to know who should be blamed. Constitutionally, the answer is very clear. The Secretary of State for Health at the time of the pandemic was declared should be held responsible. But the decisions about our preparation for a pandemic would have had to be taken years before, and it would be difficult to hold him or a previous Minister of Health responsible. At this point, I hope it will be realized that there are certain tasks in government which should not be left to current ministers, but should be the clear responsibility of the head of the civil service. In this category, I would put the readiness of the government to deal with emergencies, such as pandemics and cybersecurity attacks, the long-term capability of the civil service workforce, and issues of diversity, equality, and inclusion. And on these issues, he or she should report to Parliament and be held to account by Parliament. And each year there should be a report to Parliament. But such a reform could not, of course, take place given the current constitutional position, as the Cabinet Secretary does not have the powers to carry out such responsibilities. Turning now to the poor policy advice given by civil servants to ministers, the idea of the generalist civil servant who has good presentational skills and who is good at handling the minister is still alive and well in Whitehall. And it's not difficult to find endless examples of poor policymaking in key areas. In March 2017, for example, the Institute produced an excellent report called All Change, which looked at the policy changes and their impact in three key policy areas: further education, regional policy, and industrial policy. In all three areas, they found an almost continuous process of change and very little improvement. In the case of FE, for example, where we've had an appalling record which goes back to 1870, since the early 1980s, they found there have been 28 major pieces of legislation related to vocational FE and skill training. 6 different ministerial departments had had overall responsibility for education. 48 secretaries of state had had relevant responsibilities, and no organization set up to deal with the training, vocational training, had survived more than a decade. And in March 2017, the quality of our technical education was, in comparison with our other major countries, as poor as it was in 1870, when the first commission reported that our technical education was not as good as Germany. 16 to 24-year-old years were presented with a variety of pathways and programs of different lengths and levels, leading to qualifications valued differently by employers and provided by organizations of varying qualities. As someone joked at the time, if you were not confused by it, then you clearly had not understood it. I would also draw your attention to a recent IfG event, which is mentioned in our Better Policy Making report. At this event, John Kingman, a former second permanent secretary of the Treasury, described how he was asked by Lord Gus O'Donnell to look at the organization of the Treasury, and how he'd suggested that there were certain topics, corporate tax, say, or pensions, or the energy market, which were Treasury business, which were also ferociously complicated and technical, and perhaps not ideally suited to being left entirely to even brilliant 24-year-old generalists. He suggested creating new roles outside the conventional hierarchy for people who were expert in these areas. But as he said, his proposal hit bemusement and proved so weird and countercultural, it died a quiet death. Civil servants need to build up knowledge about key areas of policy, and particularly to know what other countries do which excel in particular policy areas. It can't be said enough that we in this country have few policy problems other than fox hunting and hereditary peers, which are not shared by other countries. And one of the most obvious things to do when reviewing a policy area is to find out which countries in the world have the best record in that policy area, and then to think what we can learn from them. Of course, the social and cultural backgrounds of countries differ, but in my experience, this is something which is usually exaggerated and rarely stops one from learning how best to do things. I think we also need to put a stop to the widely held view that policy is made by high-flying civil servants and then handed over for implementation to an inferior group of civil servants who only need to know about project management. I think it's good experience for policy experts to have on occasion the experience of implementing policies they have devised. And in my experience, the implementation of new policy also requires civil servants to have domain knowledge. As a new policy is implemented, problems will inevitably arise which can only be solved by people who have domain knowledge. I hope I've shown you that the paper on the constitutional position of the civil service, which Alec Thomas will now talk about, is not a boring administrative or institutional issue. And similarly, that poor policy-making skills of the civil service, which Tom Sass will talk about this afternoon, is also a vitally important issue. I hope it is also clear why they will form a central part of the work of the Institute in the next few years. As I said at the start of the talk, I think they are key issues which, if we want to reform the civil service, are of absolutely fundamental importance. Most of the other issues been, in the words of the late Harold Lever, no more than frolicking at the margin. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed. And now Alex is going to talk about the first of these papers. Alex, thank you, and thank you for bringing your own chair up. We don't require it of other guests, but only of our in-house.
I hope I've hit my marks. That's the got this on the stand. Thanks, Bronwen, and thank you everybody for being here today and online. It's daunting, but I've been looking forward to this sort of these ideas getting out into the wild and having a debate and a discussion about them. So really appreciate that. As Bronwen and David said, I'm going to talk a little bit about a report we published a couple of months ago about a new statutory role for the civil service. One of the things when I was sort of putting together these slides, which I hope you can see online, but I will talk through them, is you always try and come up with energizing, interesting, engaging graphics or pictures. And this is not a subject necessarily that lends itself to that. So I've got a picture there of Critchell Down, which is a field with Critchell House, which plays its own important role in accountability in government, and that's about as exciting as the pictures get. But as David says, the subject is energising and interesting enough for all of us. Without getting too sort of conceptual, I thought it was worth saying something briefly about accountability and responsibility, because the two concepts can get confused. For me, accountability is being answerable for your actions, and responsibility is having a duty to perform an action. And how that plays out in UK government and the civil service is that currently, conceptually, or theoretically at least, ministers are accountable for all of the actions and activities of their departments. Ministers are responsible for the decisions that they make, and civil servants are then accountable to ministers for the actions for which those civil servants are responsible. So again, a little bit sort of convoluted there, but these are the sorts of issues that we're dealing with. That I probably haven't done it justice, but that is a clear sort of theoretical framework. But as David said, it does seem increasingly clear that as things have developed through Critchell Down and set off by the Armstrong Memorandum that describes this position of accountability and responsibility, the complexity of government, the ambiguity and responsibility between ministers and civil servants, the limited role of Parliament in holding civil servants to account has meant that there are blurred responsibilities which have caused some problems. We may come back to that. But building a little bit on what David said, this sort of confused setup of accountability, we would argue it means a less effective and confident civil service in a number of areas. The ones we've picked out there are running the civil service functions and setting standards, managing the long-term capability of the government and the resources, ownership of risks, coordinating between departments and setting direction, and then monitoring implementation. Examples, I won't run through them all, but discussing them in the report, the pandemic contingency planning in advance of the pandemic, the test and trace system and structure, policy coordination. We'll talk more about that this afternoon, but about net zero, and the coordination of actions across government have all suffered from this confused accountability. I think there's also an additional problem there, which is it leaves the civil service more vulnerable to politicisation. So coming on to the sort of the solutions, as it were, we're proposing a new statutory role for the civil service with a stronger underpinning in statute for the civil service. This is to reinforce an impartial and permanent civil service, and grappling with some of these concepts, trying to set out a clearer objective for the civil service and also clearer responsibilities for civil servants. So the objective that we've come up with, which would be really interesting to discuss today, is to implement government programmes and to respond to events as directed by ministers. And the responsibility is to maintain the capability of UK governments, and particularly in certain areas like human resources, risk management and contingency planning, finance, as David was saying, communication standards, and so on. Those are necessarily sort of questions of meta questions, if you like, sort of questions of process, because the content of policy, the content of government work clearly needs to remain with ministers who are accountable to Parliament. But this space, this sphere for civil service responsibility seems important to define. That would also then, under this model, give more authority to the head of the civil service for running the institution, running the functions that make up and support the capability of the civil service. So the head of the civil service, permanent secretaries working to the head of the civil service, having a clear responsibility for maintaining the capability of the state. And then added to that, because the question then arises about who the civil service should be accountable to, we're suggesting a board structure with ministerial and non-executive representation, but also clearer accountability to Parliament. So we had various debates about the membership of the board. It would be, again, interesting to get a sense of who should be on this board today. But also critically, that the board then reports to a committee in Parliament annually about the effectiveness of the civil service in meeting that objective. I said the graphics weren't that exciting. This was the visualization of the statute that we're proposing. You don't need to read all of the details there, but we tried to encapsulate that in 14 clauses. It's not the actual draft that you might put into legislation, but it's a fairly succinct way of describing, as I've said, what the sort of ongoing permanent functions of the civil service are, the objective of it, the responsibilities there, and then how the system might work. This is a complicated, sort of quite subtle area, and one of the things in developing this thinking that we've tried to do is to find a clearer settlement between the responsibilities of ministers and civil servants that doesn't undermine ministers and their democratic accountability to Parliament, but creates those clearer space for responsibilities and oversight. So the benefits, as we would see it, are that the civil service would be more accountable to Parliament and to its own oversight board without undermining ministers. There's a clearer role in that objective of maintaining the responsibility, to maintain the capability of the state for the long-term capability of the state. The functions, civil servants and the head of the civil service would be more directly responsible for setting and enforcing civil service and service benchmarks. We'll talk more about this afternoon, but an improved standard of policy advice and more authority for the head of the civil service to broker between departments, and then better scrutiny and oversight for the work that the civil service does. The area, having sort of briefly set all of that out, we can get more into it as we go on, but the area I thought was most interesting just to finish with were a few sort of debates, discussions, arguments that we've had about this proposal since we published the papers a couple of months ago. And I think there are sort of broadly three areas of debate and discussion that I'm looking forward to us getting into. The first is the sort of political control set of arguments, if you like. I've had people say to me both that this is a recipe for politicisation of the civil service, because the board would be chaired by a minister and there would be a more explicit role for ministers and Parliament in the running of the civil service. I've also had it expressed that it's an anti-democratic, entrenching a perma-state of ongoing bureaucracy. And I think those are both quite interesting arguments, but we've tried to thread the needle between those two in that I don't think it would lead to politicisation, with a ministerially chaired board overseeing the civil service and holding the head of the civil service to account. The civil service is already effectively under political control. It's under ministerial control. The sorts of debates and discussions that we see about how the civil service is run, the size of the civil service, the skills of civil servants show that's the case. And actually formalising that, exposing that in a more in a clearer structure would help. The anti-democratic argument, again, ministers would still be responsible for running the civil service. It's entirely consistent with sort of democratic accountability for there to be institutional constraints that ministers have to deal with, and ultimately ministers can legislate through a majority in Parliament. But again, some really interesting discussions for me about the sort of political control. The second area of discussion is about whether legislation is needed. So we're talking about a statute for the civil service. We had an event a couple of months ago that Lord Herbert, who's here, took part, and he made quite a strong argument, I think, that there is enough legislation already underpinning the civil service, and you wouldn't introduce a bill that could lead to all sorts of unintended consequences and running off in different directions with unexpected amendments. So the existing, as I've described it in the slides there, dab of statute that just sets up the requirement for a civil service code, the existence of the Civil Service Commission, a few other sort of modest statutory underpinning is sufficient. I would say that I think the last few years have shown us that it isn't sufficient. I think where there has been a statutory underpinning, like with the Civil Service Commission, that has been important, useful, and necessary. And I think some of the other areas where we've seen the conventions and responsibilities around the civil service coming under attack would have benefited from a clearer set of objectives and responsibilities as set out in statute. The other argument in this area for me is that people say that the inherent tensions over money and administrative capacity can't be resolved through some sort of statutory settlement. So arguments about where resources are allocated are always going to be inherently political, and how can you say that the civil service has a responsibility to maintain the capability of the state when the civil servants don't ultimately control the money that would go to do that? Again, really interesting discussion there, but I think the model that we're proposing creates a forum and a much more transparent way of having those discussions. The role of ministerial directions have been much discussed recently over the Rwanda policy, and I think this model would have a crucial role for ministerial directions in clarifying accountability and responsibility. And we can get more into that as necessary. And the third area of discussions that we've had over the last couple of months are about sort of upsetting the balance of UK government. It undermines departments. It sort of centralises charter, giving the head of the civil service specific authority to run these things. I don't think that's the case. Secretaries of State would still determine policy. Permanent secretaries continue to be accounting officers. So I don't think this is a recipe for sort of sufficient for too much centralisation. As David says, it creates the conditions for the head of the civil service to set standards and set functional standards from the centre. And then, secondly, suggestion that it creates divisions between ministers and civil servants by trying to create these two sort of spheres of responsibility for capability and responsibility for policy decision making. I think the divisions between ministers and officials are already pretty evident. I think actually being more honest about the different areas of responsibility would help on that, and I think it works pretty well in New Zealand. We've been having very interesting discussions with New Zealand counterparts where chief executives, the permanent secretary equivalents in New Zealand, have more explicit responsibility for example, contingency planning, and that works pretty well for them. Finally, the question, this won't actually change anything. I think it would. I think setting out clearly the statutory responsibilities of the civil service would help create the conditions for more effective brokering across sort of coordination across government departments, clearer abilities to maintain the capability of the state. Very finally, this isn't the end of the story, as David said. We're planning a series of pieces of follow-up work on that. I'd highlight 3 broad areas. The first is, if you're going to set up this model, how should the civil service be held accountable to Parliament? What sort of information does the civil service need to provide to Parliament in order for it to be held accountable, and then how should that work in practice? Second area, to consider how to develop that new statute and what it might look like. And the third area, having a look at how the functional agenda is doing, the standards that have been set from the centre to the civil service, and how those can best be supported and embedded. I will leave it there, just touch the surface of this, but really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Alex, thanks very much indeed for setting out so clearly not just the argument of our report, but the counter-arguments and why we haven't bought them. When I said to Alex back in the autumn, could you actually write down this statute that we're arguing for? He went away and actually remarkably quickly came back with a draft. A refined version is what you were peering at up on the screen. Well, that's tremendous. Thank you again to everyone who's joining us online. Do send in your questions now, and we will have this very much as a discussion along with the people who've come to the IfG today. Let me turn to our panel now. Margaret, perhaps I could start with you, as Alex has put quite a lot of weight on accountability to Parliament having more of a say in this. What do you make of what he's saying?
So much that I'm trying to keep it sort of tight. I mean, the first thing, none of this will happen until we get a Prime Minister who is interested in actually transforming the civil servant, and we've failed to do that
and
today.
We might come back to that, not the personalities, but what would make a Prime Minister interested in it. Let's come back to that afterwards, because that's not a trivial point. But
okay, and then the other thing is, I was going to say that it's very, when you create these structures, democracy is messy, and we try to look at, it's a much messier sort of environment, a space in which you're trying to create efficiency and effectiveness. And I think we mustn't forget that when you try and mirror other models in the private sector or elsewhere, it's more difficult. And then the third thing I want to say, and it comes a little bit out of Canada, I think I would urge greater looking at what happens in local government. Because in local government, there is, it'll bring me to the relationship between the executive and the political class. Because in local government, that is set out better in statute, so I'm not against having a little statute. That might help. But it also, you don't take the politics out of the decision-making by local councillors by having a much clearer definition of what the civil servant does to what the politicians do. And one must remember that New Zealand is very small. So we've just got to look at the local government model. And Bronwen, I always look at these things, I sort of have 4 pillars at which I look at them. You know, have we got smart regulations? So is it properly set up? Is there transparency? I think transparency is key, and I'm not sure in your model that you've actually challenged that. Is there strong enforcement, and is there proper accountability? And those seems to me 4 principles which are quite sensible at looking at this. And my problem, I mean, I've talked to Bronwen about it before. I said I'd do some work around it, which I failed to do properly.
No, you went and talked to people. So this was about how other countries do accountability and how they approach it, and it is very difficult. What did you find when you went?
I think in the end, the relationship we have between ministers and the civil servants has to be thrown up and rethought completely. And I'm not sure your statute does that. Because what you talk about within the statute is, well, we already have ministers will carry on doing policy, civil servants will carry on being executive. And that just doesn't work, and it's littered with examples. I mean, even the Pincher example is really interesting. The executive should be a check and a balance on the politicians. And what's happened here, it wasn't the existing civil servants who felt able to tell the truth about what had happened. It was an ex-civil servant who came forward, protected by that to do that. So that check and balance is not there, which is why I think accountability. So I would throw the Armstrong conventions up in the air, and I would rewrite those.
In what way?
I would have much greater transparency about both policy making and the implementation of policy making, so that there is transparent.
So what does that mean? That you can get the minutes of who said what?
And then we'll come to the select committees. Which I'm sorry, I'm banging on a bit. But
No. I'm asking you.
So I would open up much more the advice that ministers get from civil servants on the development of policy and the implementation of policy. I'd open that up to much greater public account. I don't think that, again, that won't take the politics out of it. I think it'll get us much better policy making. It'll get us sort of stronger, more sustainable and lasting decisions around policy. And in doing that, I would then strengthen the role. So I would make the civil service much more directly accountable to the public through Parliament, which is in you come to the select committees. And I think there, what I think you need to do is have much greater access to papers, and that would allow you to look at the policy. I think there is too close a relationship between the bureaucracies that administer Parliament and the bureaucracy that administers government. And I think you have to separate that in a much clearer way, so there is, the Parliament, the way in which Parliament is then holds the executive to account much stronger. That comes from my experience in the PAC, where all too often when I try to go tough on somebody, I found that the House of Commons administration, more than anybody else, was trying to prevent me holding them properly to account. So I would do that, and I would therefore strengthen the capability to support select committees with a very independent administration in Parliament, answerable really to Parliament, not attending the weekly cabinet meetings and all those sort of things that I think do it. And just on some of the issues, finally, if I can.
You can. This is a discussion, and we wanted to take the time to tease out these issues. So for one, normally I'm racing the clock, not on this one.
Okay, finally, can I talk about, I think the idea that you'd have a separate civil service that could then preempt resources, which it would have to do if it had those functions, is for the birds. That won't happen. And, if we look at the pandemic, for example, the decisions not to have PPE, the PPE equipment there was a decision taken somewhere. God knows, we might one day find out where. But that would have been a political decision on the distribution of resources. And I think it's too difficult to try and define issues which are sort of preempt the resource distribution before everything else. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, what we haven't tackled, the way in which I see the politicisation of the executive comes from the development of special advisors, the growth of the special advisors. And I have to say, which Ian will want to talk about, NEDs. I think NEDs, the NEDs have become increasing politicised appointments, where the loyalty is much more to the politicians than to looking at efficiency and effectiveness. And I think if you're going to do anything about strengthening the civil service, it's a really tough agenda. I haven't got easy answers to it, but that politicisation that we have seen, and the appointment of ministers, and the appointment of people who go on to all the agencies and government agencies, it's become such a political thing that we are damaging the administration and executive. I think you have to tackle that issue. I'm not giving you answers on it, but I think you have to tackle that issue. And then one final thing as well, which is the sort of politicisation, a slight corruption of government, because we have seen that over period, is also we have to look at things like revolving doors, which I don't know whether, you know, which is another way in which I think questionable influences then determine the effectiveness and the priorities of government. So there's too much politicisation. I don't think you can take the decisions about how money is distributed out in the way that you're suggesting.
Margaret, thanks very much indeed. And there's a couple of points, more than a couple of points in there that I'm going to come back to you on. But thank you very much for taking us straight into this question of accountability to Parliament. Ian, you have a lot of notes there.
Yes.
And but the first point, if I could steer you towards the first point I'd love you to talk about before expanding on those, is one that David mentioned centrally, which is that the question of how far the head of the civil service can run the organisation, and whether this needs to be strengthened.
Well, look, could I maybe do the political trick of not answering that question and answering sort of the one I came with, which I suppose includes that one.
That was that one.
In context, I will.
Yeah.
But because I think what we've got is, to build on Margaret's point, is we've got a meta problem into which this civil service issue fits. And I think the civil service, as we've discussed often, the Constitution is necessary but not sufficient to solve all the issues in government. So it's a key issue, but it interplays with a lot of the issues that Margaret's raised. And so I think we've got a systemic problem that there isn't a system, essentially. We've got a fragmented government which does not operate to a coherent, sustainable strategic plan. And David's analysis of the difference between corporate world and what I saw in Whitehall is that there is no integrated corporate strategy. There's a series of things which ultimately are only mediated probably by the Prime Minister or at number 10. So I completely agree with Margaret. There's no way a civil service board could do major star chamber type trade-offs, because that ultimately is a political call, and it's worked effectively. I think when the Quad was working, that was one of the better examples of actually how that trade-off can be made to work. But then there is fundamentally not enough of a central system with then distributed responsibility. So I think the points on accountability and responsibility are great, but the fundamental framework is missing to allow a lot of this stuff to work effectively. And compounded with the other problem related to that, which is that politicians on the whole are not as interested in government as I would have expected. They're interested in the politics of it, but actually delivery is much further down the list. So I think unless you've got a machine with a strategic plan, and I think one of the works when we looked at the New Zealand stuff was really interesting, with customer outcome measures in it. What is government doing for citizens and people it impacts? And then the accountability loop to say, well, if you're trying to have that outcome, how well have we done? What do we need to do to change the plan? And you go around that continuous improvement loop. There's all those conditions which are, frankly, and I think you're right, Margaret, much easier in corporate life. Government's much more complicated, much messier, much greyer. But the systemic gap means that a lot of good stuff just doesn't get done because the framework isn't there. Now, the second level on this, I think it is really important that civil service capability is taken seriously. And I think that does mean that things like the functional agenda, the quality of people, the training and development of those people is given to the head of the civil service as a job. You know, you are responsible for the quality. And I was surprised, as I sort of learnt my way into government, to sort of not see that structure. There were bits of it and vestigial examples of it that looked like the head of a civil service was actually there. But when I got to my experience of being in DWP and I was looking at the centre, it was a very different picture. And I think it is actually time to try and break that sort of link and say, no, the quality of civil service is of national governmental importance, and we should have someone who is responsible for that capability development, functional capability. Boring but important things, as David has often discussed, like a chart of accounts that everyone can understand and a common system, are really important. And the fragmentation that we have is a reflection of the fact that the head of civil service has influence and reflected power from the Prime Minister, but surprisingly little real reach into departments. So I think... May
I just ask you at that point, that the counter-argument that Alex mentioned is often thrown at us at this point is, what if you give the head of the civil service all those responsibilities, but he or she doesn't have control of the money?
Well, I think you can set out the budget. You know, to my mind, the difference I draw in the money bit is I wouldn't say money for big policy decisions, like do you build HS2, political. money for how much money do we invest in training and developing our civil service should be derogated to this board. It should be absolutely empowered to them. And I never understood the argument that the Perm Sec made, which is I want to decide my own FD, for example, in a way that a subsidiary of a large company would have the group FD and the local CEO would decide together, and the functional capability of that person is absolutely determined by the function. So it is a matrix organisation. And I can't see any reason to reinvent the wheel 26 times, which is what the departments are doing.
But who decides, what does it do to the responsibilities of the head of the civil service if if a politician decides, for example, that the civil service should be, say, 91,000 smaller in number?
Well, look, I mean, this is the never-ending cycle of how particularly the spending review works. But I mean, at least to my mind, if you had a structure and a sort of strategic plan, you could have a strategic 5-year conversation rather than pick a number out of the air. And I think you would talk about, are we investing in the capability of those people rather than the absolute sort of sums involved? And I think without that counterweight of saying, well, what level of quality do we want, in particularly systems, HR, finance, and also project management. I mean, there's been a huge improvement in the project management of the capability of the government, but it was non-existent sort of 5 to 10 years ago. There weren't even trained project managers. So there shouldn't be a debate about, do we need data analysts, do we need program managers? That should be a professional civil service derogation, and it has no impact on, I would have thought, my view would be a minister would welcome the fact you have high quality civil servants to help him do that stuff. But in the final point, I'd just like to pick on the politicisation. I'm sitting here now as a chair of an ALB in the shape of Channel 4, and my observation is over the certainly the last 5 years, much more political scrutiny of appointments than I've ever seen. The NED model has shifted, particularly with Michael Gove, into a much more of a SPAD ministerial role. And I do agree that I think both of those are dangerous. I think that there is a lack of check and balance. And I think my personal view is that we shouldn't have members of the House of Lords as non-exec directors. And I tried to sort of maintain that when I was lead non-exec, because I think we need distinction between the legislative and the executive capabilities. And, in the same way that in my PLC existence, I welcome deeply independent, principled, useful, diverse people as being incredibly important for the health of the organisation. I think the same is true for departments and government.
Ian, thanks very much indeed. Some great questions coming in, and some responding to Ian and Margaret, so thank you for that. I'm going to come to them in a moment. Jonathan, what do you make of this? And you've seen this
play out.
At close quarters. What do you make, obviously, of the statutory pitch that Alex has made, but also would love your views on what you have heard already.
Yeah, well, so I am persuaded of the case for a statute on the basis that we have a lack of clarity over all the things we're talking about now. I don't believe for a moment that legislation can of itself solve everything. I spent quite a lot of my time as a government lawyer persuading ministers they didn't need legislation or that it would be a bad idea. But sometimes it can help. As with a contract, the process of drawing up the contract helps you define terms and the rules of engagement and allocates roles and responsibilities and all the rest of it. And if all goes well, you put the contract away and you never need to look at it unless there's a row or a problem. But at the moment, we do have a problem. Because of the lack of clarity over the role and responsibility, the allocation of roles and responsibilities that we've heard about, and more, in the real world, day to day, if you have ministers accusing civil servants of thwarting policy, or civil servants being put in the position of having to lie or do other unpalatable things, or the kind of constant running battle over who decides whether civil servants should be in the office or not. Day to day, this is not a functioning set of relationships. So I think legislation could help to set some parameters, set some rules, and it won't necessarily solve all the problems, but it will give you some help. And if you to take an example that we keep coming back to, we posited the idea that the civil service should somehow have some ongoing responsibility for long-term planning for emergencies, for example, or for the long-term health and capability of the civil service. Well, I'm not sure whether every politician would agree with that, but let's have a go at defining it and getting some agreement. And then if a permanent secretary at some point is faced with the kind of challenge I think that Margaret's talking about, a permanent secretary says, look, I've got this legal responsibility to plan for emergencies. It's going to cost some money, and this is what I think I should do. And the Secretary of State says, well, I'm not interested in any of that. And why should you have any money for it? Well, you've got a legal responsibility that the permanent secretary can point to. Now, that's not of itself going to solve the problem. You then have some kind of mechanism for helping to solve the problem, to resolve what is by now a conflict, which is what a contract would do. And that might be the board that's been suggested. It might ultimately be, which I think is really your model, that if in the end the Prime Minister decides. So it is a political question. If it's about allocation of resources or competing priorities, the Prime Minister decides. And that may be the model, but at least you've got a kind of legal process which acknowledges the existence of the competing roles, gives the Permanent Secretary a kind of legal hook on which he can have the debate, which we don't have at the moment, and then has a mechanism, a dispute resolution mechanism, if you like, or an accountability mechanism, which ultimately resolves the problem. And there'll be lots of variants of this, but the basic point, I think, is you've got a problem at the moment. You don't have clarity over any of those things, and legislation could help to set one up.
Thanks very much indeed for that. And again, I've got loads of questions, but I'm not going to take mine now. I'm going to take yours. Unusually, because this is a conference, and it's not simply a conversation or an event, and we have a bit more time, I'm going to say that if people want to make their own comments, not just put them in question form, that is okay. Some of those are coming in now. Is there anyone in the room who'd like to kick us off? Excellent. At the back here. And if you'd like to say who you are, that is great.
Dave Penman, General Secretary of the FDA. When you talk about this kind of role of the centre and strengthening the centre, I think the closest we ever got to it, in my experience, has been from about 2010 to 2015, when actually what we had was strong political leadership around the Minister for the Cabinet Office, Francis Maud. I did not agree with a lot of things he did, but when you talk about things like the project management skills, those were part of his drive around both efficiency and improving the skills of the civil service. And I just wonder, whatever kind of constitutional settlement you think might come and settle some of this stuff, unless it comes with real political weight, it's just going to fall apart as we're seeing. You know, I mean, you could have this situation, but if 4 ministers are going to come up with a number based on 2016 for the size of the civil service, everything you talk about falls apart. And I just wonder how strong you think actually there has to be political will behind this to make it work, rather than a legislative or kind of constitutional settlement.
Who'd like to? Alex, do you want to?
Do you want me to briefly come on this? Because I want to hear what others say, really. But I think I completely agree. You absolutely need political will, political focus to both sort of change and sustain the civil service. And I also completely agree with Margaret that politics is messy. This is not. There are going to be periods of better, stronger, more interested political leadership of the civil service, and periods of less interested political leadership of the civil service. That's going to be a cycle or a sort of rhythm or whatever. I think the benefit, and it goes to what Jonathan was saying, of having an underpinning statute is it gives you a sort of base level of authority there. I agree that the politics could disrupt it, but if you have a board that would have been chaired, let's say, by Francis Maud, might be chaired by, until yesterday, Steve Barclay. Now there's a structure there to have those discussions, and more more formal underpinning than we have, that allows that authority to be exercised. Yes, sometimes better, sometimes worse. And I think this goes a little bit to Margaret's points and Jonathan's points about local government. And local government, goodness knows, isn't perfect. And I completely recognise the essential political nature of resource allocation decisions. But as Jonathan said, if you have certain legal obligations and responsibilities on permanent secretaries and a forum for deciding those, and a forum that gives the head of the civil service a certain amount of authority to run the machine, then you're going to be better placed than we are at the moment.
Could I just... Sorry.
Go on, you go.
Just to add, I completely agree with, my experience was that when there's political interest in this topic, it gets traction.
Yeah.
And having just said that Michael Gove has politicised some of his appointments, he is actually, to be fair, the person that's been most interested in this topic. And I was really hopeful for a time that we'd see essentially almost like a deputy PM type level of interest in this. Because I think you're right, it does need that level of traction. And when we're talking about the composition of the board, we had a few conversations because we started saying, well, surely the Prime Minister should run this because it's the government. I think realistically you won't get the bandwidth, but it's effectively like a deputy PM level role, and somebody has to therefore care about it. So I think it's absolutely vital that the politicians own this agenda rather than just think it's a dry political...
Okay, but going to my question there, which you or Margaret could answer, what would make a Prime Minister interested, necessarily interested in this, not just as a quirk of personality or political history?
What would make him do it?
We don't want to go into quirks of personality.
I mean, the first thing I was going to do is say is, let's get real. If you're sitting in health and it's a choice between cutting waiting lists and investing in PPE, where would the money go? That's the real politique, and the money would go in cutting the waiting list. So that's it. I think, Bronwen, I come back to this, really boring, accountability. So if you do have a legislative framework, which you think might help create a more rational approach to the allocation of resources to keep a strong civil service, I think the only way you can do it is the head of the civil service will have to be able to go openly to the relevant select committee of Parliament. And we will have to see transparent. Maybe we should see the minutes of this board meeting. Maybe all that should be open to parliamentary scrutiny, and that would be the only way of trying to keep some sort of rational oversight, which keeps it going a little bit. That's the only thing I can think of.
I'd offer one other slightly. This is going to sound incredibly self-serving as a trustee of the Institute, but I am also really struck by how little training ministers get in terms of how to run departments. And I think something which actually requires training for every junior minister, you have to have some form of training, not necessarily just courtesy of the IfG, but anywhere else, about the mechanics and the machinery of government, because people are so uninformed when they hit. I don't know if, Nick, your experience was like that when you encountered it. But actually illustrating the systemic and sort of managerial side of being a minister, because you just don't get the preparation for it, which is why the local government example is interesting, because most people have probably worked their way through something and they know the system. In a lot of people, they're landing in ministerial roles with absolutely no idea of what they're doing. So why would they be interested?
The Institute does offer private coaching for ministers as they're taking their jobs, and we're setting up the academy to bring our How to Do It work together under Hannah White, Deputy Director. Jonathan, did you want to chip in something?
Well, let me just say the obvious. First of all, you're never get any legislation unless there's political will for it. As some of us were saying earlier, that the Constitution and the role of the civil service, these ought to be very boring questions on which politicians are not very interested most of the time. As we've been saying, actually, they should be. And this is partly about persuading politicians that there is a problem to be solved, and that the problem ultimately is about the effectiveness of their government. This is what it takes to persuade a Prime Minister or senior ministers that this is worth investing in, and legislative time and so on, is persuading them that actually there's a real-world problem and this can help solve it. Easier said than done.
Thank you. There's lots of hands up in the room, and thank you. And I'm going to come to you in a second. I'd like to take one online from Rachel Gore of the Department for Levelling Up and Housing and Communities. And she says, in terms of civil service cultural change, how could we reshift the mechanism of policy making from officials crafting policies based on what is deliverable to one where policy process is genuinely driven by goals of providing sound and objective recommendations? you'd like to. Alex, I'm looking at you, but it doesn't mean that you have to.
Sounds like this afternoon.
Yes, it may be,
You're all right, you give us a taster of this
It shouldn't be a
afternoon.
conflict between the two. You want goals and sound, but you want it to be deliverable. And I think actually it was something that David said in his early contribution. I would say you want the two, and I wouldn't put them against each other. In your early contribution, one of the problems with the civil service we're talking, which is slightly off piece, Bronwen, is that there is status in developing policy. There is absolutely no status within the civil service in implementing policy, and until you tackle that, I always used to think the people who create the policy should then
Have to live it.
must implement it, and you've got to create a career structure which facilitates that and gives them proper rewards along that journey. But it's crazy that we have got that thing. So I don't think it's one or the other, I think it's both.
Great. I can see Tom Sass, who's going to be presenting this afternoon's work on policy making, sitting right there. Alex.
Yeah, I won't take Tom's thunder, but I agree. I think two, it prompted two thoughts. One, totally agree with Margaret, it shouldn't be one or the other. I do think the civil service could and should get better at what it would call in the jargon multidisciplinary teams. I think having one team that is assembled to address a problem, FE, as David was saying earlier, that then holds that problem through the whole cycle is the right thing to do. I think that team doesn't necessarily have to be led by a policy person. The sort of classic model would be that the policy official would be the convener of that team. I think that's not necessarily and always the right model, and so combining and sustaining those teams seems like an important change to make. The second point was just, and I think Simon Case said something interesting in a lecture he gave in Newcastle last October, which was that the traditional model was, or the traditional assumption about the UK civil service was that the policymakers were the elite and were the highly skilled ones, and that there was something, as Francis Moore, the blue collar implementers had lower status. I think there's something interesting in the pandemic where that slightly flipped around, and actually it was the policymaking functions that really struggled under the intensity of the immediate pandemic response, and some of the people closer to operations and delivery who stepped up to the mark.
Thanks. Okay, great. Let's go here by the fireplace.
Okay. Hello, I'm Tony Travers from the London School of Economics. It seems to me that the discussion, as is so often in this room, is a rational one, rational people. And of course, the great thing about the current government is a sort of limiting case, isn't it? It's a useful way of being able to ask the question, would the kind of rational proposals set out by Alex work with any government in any circumstances? And the answer is, well, if they can't, then they won't work. I mean, any imaginable government. So this government is quite useful in that sense because it offers a way of saying, would the kind of proposals suggested work with this government? That's come up several times indirectly. So in that sense, and if not, why not? So that would be the first thing. The other thing, referring to something Margaret said, I mean, the thing is that the kind of discussions that also have gone on in this room many times before are, at some level, if we just put aside what's going on as we speak, the scale of government is so large, so big, that the money that's spent is so great that it's de facto infinite. Government is infinite. It's too big to imagine. There's a big reform of the NHS going on as we speak. I defy anybody to describe how the NHS is run in their area, how you'd hold any of the money to account in your area, get anything done locally. These things are too complicated, too big for anybody rationally to come to terms with. If you go outside the building, when you leave today, you'll be able to look at the streets and make a judgment about the City of Westminster and its chief executive, Stuart Love. Are the streets paved? Are they lit? Are they clean? You can make a judgment about that. Go up into Soho, it won't be quite as beautiful looking, but you can still make a judgment again. Jeremy Pocklington, who's the permanent secretary at DLUC, who's overseeing local government, how much has he contributed as a senior civil servant? I'm not picking on these two individuals other than we happen to be located here. Yeah. So going back to Margaret's point, if government were not operating at such a massive scale, and given the procedures in local government for holding its chief officers to account, would it be easier to hold government to account? We know trust is higher in local politicians than national ones. Lots of evidence about that. So I think the scale of government may actually make all the reforms suggested here more difficult to deliver on their objectives, not because they're not good proposals, but because the scale of government renders it infinite.
Really interesting points, Tony. Thank you very much indeed. Jonathan, may I turn to you first? Would these proposals work with this government?
So obviously I'm a lawyer, and there's a risk of me instantly leaping to kind of legal solutions. And I promise you, I don't do that and wouldn't normally do it. I mean, I think this government, just at the moment, is unlikely to want to implement these proposals anyway.
Right.
But if they had already existed, would they help? And my answer is, I think they would have helped. Yeah. Because actually, for better or worse, one of the few constraints on any government, particularly this one, is the law. I mean, it doesn't particularly like the fact there are legal constraints, and in various ways it's tried to dilute them. But nonetheless, the law is kind of there and ultimately is capable of being enforced. And in my example, it is something that a civil servant can point to. So a civil servant now can at least point to the Civil Service Code and the existing legislation, and it's there in black and white. It can't be wished away as a constraint. And that's why I favour a model where there is some legal underpinning. However, it may be no more than a framework, but at least it would help. And it would force ministers ultimately to have the conversation. If you had some kind of governance body, well, that would have some legal status. So it won't solve everything, but my view is that having some kind of legal baseline that the government can't just wish away and can't at least completely ignore would help. And then you get into the more complicated question of precisely what it would look like. And as I say, I don't see this government being up for that conversation. But over time, if we can have it, then I think it would help.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. Although I do take the point, Tony, there'll be variations of sort of compliance, shall we say. But I think it from my side, experience of working with civil service, they do take that seriously, and it is the sort of thing they need in that conversation with politicians who might be pushing. In terms of your point about scale, which is brilliant, I mean, it's a really major issue.
You put it beautifully.
Yeah, it's a great point, and particularly in the temptation of a series of economic pandemic crisis, which we can sort of print our way out of apparently with impunity. There is a temptation just to keep going bigger. My normal answer to that is that what you should have is a sort of structure of delegation and authority which says certain decisions are meta and have to be taken at this level. And with Jeremy Pocklington, there'll be sort of 4 or 5 of those big decisions about allocation of budgets. Where organisations, and I would take the private world, we dealt with a multi-billion-pound company, and the only way you can do that with 80,000 people is you set a series of frameworks and decision-making is clear about who's spending what money where, and the accountability, to follow Margaret's point, has to follow it. So the NHS, in theory, with ICPs, you should be able to have that conversation in a geographic, place-based way, which wasn't possible before. The logic's great. I worry to death about how it's going to be implemented and how obviously it'll be traded off. But I think unless you can construct the delegated authority and say, well, who's spending what at what level, you'll never understand it. But I think that's why accountability is so important, is that we have to have a framework against which you can hold people accountable. And it is big and complicated, and it's getting harder because of that scale point.
Thank you. Okay, let's go over here. There's a question. Yep. But you need a microphone.
Just so that you can be heard.
And also to say who you are for the record.
So, Anthony Selden, and can I say I agree with much of, if not everything, that Margaret and Ian and Jonathan and Alex, you have been saying. I just want to get back to, are we being bold enough? Are we being just a little bit too English, British here about it? We found it at the Times, the Education Commission looking at, we've reported in a year, really our deplorable education system in Britain, which we hear a lot about how good it is, but by most measures it is failing, and it's absurdly out of touch with modern technology that we haven't perhaps heard enough about yet, and modern practices and what's happening abroad. We are incredibly insular. Now, coming back to David's questions that he posed at the beginning about what IfG was created for and is it achieving enough, I think IfG is a wonderful organisation. I think if we're going to get leadership anywhere in this country, it's going to come from this organisation. But let's look at government in the last 6 years. By any standard, we haven't had a glorious period of premiership or indeed ministers. Michael Goseby mentioned he is one of the remarkably few effective cabinet ministers. By the end of this year, we're likely to have a new head of the civil service and likely to have a new prime minister. That will be the 4th within 6 years. That is a rate of churn which is wholly unacceptable. So what is it that we can be doing? Well, David mentioned at least 2 of them. What works best? We need a civil service, on top of everything that you say, which you are so right in what you pointed out. We need a civil service that looks much better at what works best in this country and abroad. Love that point about, was it hereditary peers and fox hunting? Apart from that, pretty much, there's an awful lot more to be learned about what's happening abroad. Secondly, much more on the long term, one of Jeremy Haywood's points, and by the way, Boris Johnson was going around saying, I need my Jeremy. Well, I'm sorry, chum, but you actually destroyed the structure on which Jeremy Haywood, for whom Alex worked, was able to achieve as much as he did. But one of the last things he said to me was, we are not nearly good enough at looking after the long-term problems here. We're far too focused on jerky, reactive government. I'd love to see more there, and also more on something that IfG has been in the lead on, which is learning from history. How can we learn from what has happened more? And not the least, you get every new prime minister who comes in, trashes their predecessors, of course, chucks out civil service people who actually know how to do things, brings in new teams, know-nothings, and hey presto, they find out that nothing is working. So leadership nationally is urgent, point 1, and 2, if IfG can't provide it, it ain't going to happen.
Great.
There you are, Bronwen.
No pressure. No pressure. Just save the country.
We're not setting out to provide leadership. We're setting out to provide a model for recommendations for how it ought to work better. Margaret.
Can I just come in on the one thing in the long term? This is so hard because it's so obviously true. If we could have a longer view, it'd be right. But just think about it. So we've had 3 prime ministers in, what have you said, 4 years. Politics doesn't work like that. So the guys that we're putting, the people that we're putting at the top of these organisations, just move too much. I was a minister under most of the Blair years, and it was dreadful. It takes you 6 months to come to grips with your portfolio. And then 3 months later, you're sitting there in the car waiting for the phone call to say, oh, you've got a job. And if you've got a job, where will you be moved to? So actually Cameron did that better. But with the instability at the top, we're in a terrible position. And it's the same with the civil service. What civil servant sits in a job for more than 2 years? When I was children's minister, which is the job I held for most, I always tell this story, I had it for about 2 years, 2.5 years, I can't remember. By the end of my period there, I had more institutional memory than any of the people I was working with. That's shocking. And David must have had more because he was the only one in the Labour government who kept his job right the way through. But it was shocking. So, there's something we could do about civil service and career progression and all that. It's very difficult to do anything about politics. And this inability to learn from history, I do keep thinking, as one gets older, you keep thinking, you watch the same thing happening again and again and again. And I spend a lot of time mentoring my younger colleagues now. And I think, oh my God, we did this, we tried that. It was exactly the same bloody problem. And we never are able to learn. We do not learn from history. And I don't know how you could institutionalize in a more effective way a capability within both government and within politics, which would enable you to do that. And there's a lot, people are great at just, the final thing I was going to say, politicians in particular, if you want to leave a legacy, you're there, you've got to do it yesterday because you'll be gone tomorrow. So there's an absolute sort of imperative on doing it straight away. And the best thing you can do is, the easiest thing you can do is destroy what happened in the past. And once you cut something down, it takes you forever to rebuild it. It's much easier to cut than to rebuild. So that whole thing, for me, it was urban regeneration before I was an MP and when I was in local government. I think we had a new initiative on urban regeneration every ruddy year. And we all know that if you are actually going to do something that really impacts and starts to transform life opportunities, you have got to do it over a 10, 15-year period. And it just never happens. And I think there's a great destruction. That's another thing. Politics is quite a destructive force in that you're always undoing. I mean, I'm seeing them now on the early years stuff. We did some really good work around early years, with the framework, the educational framework and the qualification. That's all been absolutely hammered. It'll take forever to rebuild. And there is no learning at all from why we did it and what was behind it and trying to set it up. Easy to destroy it and say, oh, we're doing something about cost of living. Pathetic.
Thank you. Alex, and maybe you'd want to tuck into this your recommendations on civil servants not moving around as often and what could be done about pay and promotion. Yeah,
completely. And again, it touches a little bit on some of the afternoon stuff, but we do, recognising politics is messy, that and rightly so. Democracy is messy, debate is messy, but we do have a permanent civil service, and so I suppose for me, partly this is about maximising the use of that asset and doing it in a way that is consistent with democratic accountability and a sort of thriving plural democracy that goes through its more or less stable periods. But it exists, so sort of let's make the most of it, which comes back to Bronwen's point there about certainly I experienced it. I worked for 5.5 years on constitutional and electoral stuff, but I think every other job I was spinning around quite often, so I was part of the problem. But I completely recognise that the incentives that operate on civil servants, and I think it's less about pay, but I do think it's about promotion. So pay matters, but it's the status and associated pay that comes with promotion that really bites on civil servants. And I think you're far more likely to get promoted if you do 3 jobs in 5 years rather than 1 job in 5 years that includes implementation.
So what should be done about that?
So I think it's changing the rewards for promotion. Yeah. In order to get promoted, you need to have demonstrated that you have done that stint and that you have solid implementation and delivery record to your name. There's always going to be a space for the courtier civil servant who is able to fix problems and put fires out for ministers and do that. But alongside that, officials need to be able to demonstrate that they've done that in order to get promoted. Very, very briefly, just on international comparisons, because I was a little bit, I was a bit sceptical about international comparisons, and I completely take Margaret's point about New Zealand being quite different. But the scales fell from my eyes a bit when I spoke to a colleague in New Zealand a little while ago, and he said, of course everywhere's different, but we're a small country, but on some things, we compare ourselves to and draw experience from Westminster-style democracies. On others, we look to Southeast Asia because it's our neighbourhood. On others, we're the size of, Greater Birmingham, so we look to Birmingham for. So it's having these sort of subtlety to look to the comparisons that matter and that work that I do think we need to be better at internationally. Anyway, I'll stop.
Jonathan, I don't want to dip too much into this notion of turnover because it's central to what we're talking about this afternoon and policy making, but you were head of a group of specialised people, the government lawyers. How did you?
Well, I won't bore people with my specialist subject, which is how we reformed the legal function in government. But one thing we did do is basically bring it all together in one as a function. There you go. So we could manage it. And that included definitely managing people's careers. and trying to avoid the excessive churn. Maybe it's easier to do, though, when you have a particular specialist cadre and you already have a kind of base level of transferable skills. But I think there probably are things that can be learned from that model, and it does require a bit of command and control. So one of the advantages of what is now the Government Legal Department that I helped set up and led was that ultimately I could make these decisions through a board and so on about how people moved and what the rules were and how people got promoted. And if you could somehow upscale that, much more difficult to do. I mean, I had, 2,000-3,000 people. Well, okay, that's big enough to be able to do interesting things with, but it's obviously not the same kind of scale that applies to other bigger functional groupings, or let alone the whole civil service. But there is something about that model, and ultimately it is about having the power to make decisions and implement them. And it may be, I think this is probably less true now. At the time, that felt, I mean, I had the consent of the then Attorney General for doing what I did as my minister. I certainly had the support of Jeremy Hayward at the time. I had the consent of the support of Francis Maud, because he liked this kind of thing. So it worked. And most of what I was doing was below the political radar. So I could get on and do it with proper political cover and consent. I suspect that wouldn't be true now, because everything is politicised. So it may have been at the time it was just a bit easier to do it. But there are certainly some lessons there, I hope.
I'm going to take a couple of, there were some very, very good questions come in online. I want to take a couple of them now. One from Amy on, she's saying, where does the IfG stand on ease of dismissing civil servants? Should we be protecting civil servants and hence, theoretically at least, giving them confidence to challenge, or sharpening accountability and incentives to perform? Well, that's directed at the IfG. I think everyone is going to have views on that. And let me take a second one from Hartley Miller. Should the National Audit Office's remit be expanded so that it can assess and report on the capability of the civil service and of departments to deal with anticipated situations, initiatives and crises, including civil service training, planning, structure, and all the things we've been talking about? Thank you for both those questions. Who'd like to start? Ian.
Yeah, I mean, I think the topic of the civil service employment, I did find it very peculiar that we couldn't change the some of the people in the department that were clearly not performing, frankly. And I know this is a difficult subject, but if I again compare it to corporate life, we're not looking to politicise people through hire and fire techniques, but there should be more capability to assemble teams and then change teams if people work and don't work. And I think I would just appeal for equality with the sort of corporate world, in that sense, that you don't just go around firing people for the sake of it, but you do have to have flexibility. And I think it's a small issue in the civil service. It's not as bad as the churn issue, but it is an issue that needs addressing. I don't think it's the top of my list.
I'm deducing from the flavour of what you're saying that you also want a bit of corporate firmness in moving people out of the civil service if it is not working.
If it's not working, I think realistically any organisation,
rather than round and round.
Yeah, rather than this endless shuffle. And I think it's almost dishonest, frankly, if we don't address those issues. And performance is a common human issue that we have to deal with. But we have to deal with people the right way and with the correct set of rules. But there should be more ability to make changes there. But with the issue being that the reward, you're not rewarding people for basically being minister friendly. You actually got to reward people for being good at their jobs and particularly good at delivery. And I think being more explicit about what performance looks like would allow you to have a much clearer apolitical debate, because you'd have some measures involved with it. And I think, just finally on the NAO, I mean, I think the idea of this board is to surface the issue of capability and performance. And so one part of that could well be that the NAO reviews that the way they review other things. But I think you've got to have the structure in place before we have the NAO there.
Just on the other thing, you've got to watch it. You know, the Jonathan Slater sacking was not a good time. So I'm all for people should be assessed against their capability right the way through the organisation. But to do that, you know, was not, and so there has to be some parameters around that. And actually, the NAO does look at the capability of the civil service. I think lots of the reports I had up when I was, you know, so I don't think it needs changes in its terms of reference or anything. And we looked, you know, and I think one of the things that in my time we did, which is rather well, is we looked at projects through their life. So we took the Olympics through their life. We looked at when the probation service was being privatised at that time. We took it from initial thought right the way through. And so I think it does it rather well, actually. And I don't think it needs, and we always looked at capability of the civil service in relation to that. I don't know unless you felt as recipients of it that it could have done it better, but I felt it did take that quite well.
Always felt appropriately uncomfortable to be looked at by the NAO. I also think there's a danger with expanding the NAO's remit too much, because I agree. It needs to be that sort of authoritative auditing body, and I think if you take it too far into some of the political and policy debates, then there's a danger for the sort of the nature of the national.
One of the things I would love to happen, Bronwen, completely, is I think we need a review of the audit function within the public sector, because we got rid of the local authority audit capability, and I think that means that actually now local authorities, and whether you talk about actually health service leaders, whether you look at the health or whether police or whatever, aren't as well audited.
You and I have talked about this, Margaret, but I think there's a problem really stored up for the future, which we're beginning to see, and with the end of the Audit Commission and lack of scrutiny on local government things. Amy had asked explicitly for the IfG view on ease of dismissing civil servants. Do you want to give it, or shall I, or do we rely on telepathy working?
You can then tell me if I'm wrong. Clearly, I mean, it's broadly what Ian said, I think. So there is a certain, you know, if you're a permanent secretary or head of the civil service, there is a certain level of inevitable jeopardy, I suppose, about that job. You are exposed, like any chief executive, to events, some of which you control and some of which you don't control. But it does seem that, you know, ministers will always serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. There needs to be some element of fairness and procedural fairness around that for everybody in the organisation. But equally, people who aren't performing need to be managed out. I mean, one of the differences, it always struck me in between the civil service and other sectors, is the rounds of redundancy, voluntary or compulsory, are rarer perhaps than in other sectors. But then when they come in a sort of explosive and somewhat uncoordinated way. So you're not having a sort of every couple of years 3, 4, 5% of the civil service is leaving because they're not suited to the jobs that they're doing. So you don't have that kind of refreshing of the civil service, and then you get a 91,000 job cuts that means the wrong people leave, they leave in the wrong areas, and it's done in an uncoordinated way that's counterproductive to effect.
On which we have an excellent piece written by Alex. Okay, there's some terrific questions online which I will get to. Let's come back to the room. Here, please.
Susanna from Civil Service World. We've spoken a lot about the statute and the political side of it. I wonder if we could reflect on the impact on the civil service were such a statute to go through. I think it seems to me it would need cultural change in the civil service to kind of adapt to a new framework as set out by the statute. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I'm reflecting on kind of conversations I've had over the years with, for example, John Manzoni would often complain civil servants are too good at managing up. They're too focused on what do the ministers say. So undoubtedly there would be situations where civil servants would feel emboldened and reassured by having a legal framework to point to, but perhaps also situations where they would find themselves uncomfortable in the new sort of landscape on this statute. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what kind of change might be needed, how hard would it be, where would it come from?
Really interesting point, and you put it very well. I'd like to take a second question at the same time. There's one in here, and thanks for your patience. Here in the front.
It's Andrew Kakabadze, Henley Business School. There were 2 points in the report, too much chemistry and the role of the Minister as Chair.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last bit. And the role of...
Minister as Chair of the Board.
Yep.
I did undertake an investigation. Too much chemistry. No company, no UN agency, no charity of any size would ever come up with the term too much chemistry. Number one, the chemistry between the chair and the CEO is absolutely vital. I'll tell you companies that did try and come up with structures and not the chemistry issue, they were known as Barings Bank, Enron, Marconi, RBS, HBOS, Carillion. When I looked at what happened here, I found that the chemistry was most interesting. The civil servants, I've never seen in any country or any company such a devotion to service and government. The devotion was because of belief in representative democracy, and the Secretary of State was the embodiment of representative democracy. When I looked at the other side, and I come from medicine, what I found was the minister's treating of civil servants was close to a battered wife syndrome. And I found it very difficult to see any other walk of life that would put up with a situation like this. I went to New Zealand, and what did I find in New Zealand? A very transactional approach that would be, you could not apply it here because of the complexities that we have due to size and other factors. Here, the values of the civil service, unless we're very careful, are going to be undermined. The second is then the minister as chair of the board. Yes, I hear about Michael Gove, but in the investigation I undertook, there were many ministers as chair of the board that didn't turn up, turned up late, used the board as a vehicle for a political platform, not politicized, it was just their point of view. In fact, I found 2 ministers only out of 160 interviews that I would say were competent to be a chair of a governance board. So my conclusion is this: if this investigation, which I find incomplete, had undertaken an analysis of the point of chemistry, then all right, I could see the balance between what you discover on chemistry with structures, and we can see whether this will work or not. But leaving aside what the Prime Minister does in this government or any other government, when you have the minister as chair of a board, whatever you want to do won't happen. What we need is professional chairs, and the minister needs to take away from that. So 2 very practical points. Leave aside the big issues. We have here a set of values that at our peril we damage if we go down this particular road. And secondly, if you want to set up a structure so that any minister, prime minister can actually work it, we need to professionalize the role of the chair in order to have a professional governance which provides oversight.
Thank you very much. 2 very interesting questions. Jonathan.
Well, perhaps I'll take the first one on what legislation would mean for civil servants. And I mean, first of all, I think this would be a very big change for the civil service, a big constitutional change, and I think deliberately so, because we're saying there are serious problems and serious uncertainties in the current system, and this would be, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to clarify them. I think that if this were done properly, it would have to involve a process of consultation with civil service, with Parliament, obviously with ministers, and I'm sure Alex wouldn't claim that the model set out here is the final version or the polished. So we'd have to have a conversation to which civil servants would be a party, I think. And I used the analogy of a contract earlier. I mean, this is about the contract between a multi-party contract, if you like, between civil service, ministers, Parliament, the state, and this is, under any contract, what you're trying to do is get clarity about the roles, responsibilities, rights, also duties, and if we get it right, there will be both benefit and there will be obligation too for both sides. And what we're saying is that some of that will need to change. But if we do get it right, then the advantage of clarity for both sides, so civil servants know where they stand, ministers know where they stand, there's a mechanism for resolving the difficult cases. I think civil servants ought to be reassured by that, but undoubtedly it would involve change, and they should be part of designing it.
I mean, I think you're right, it would require a level of change in cultural approach, frankly, a bit on both sides, but I think actually it is still consistent with speaking truth under power, and I think it is actually a necessary pushback on some of the the trends that have happened. So I think from a civil service point of view, I would suggest they should, we should they would welcome that. And on Andrew's point, we've disagreed on this in the past because I sort of partly agree with the analysis and certainly the point about lack of ministerial expertise. The problem is that with the departmental structure, if the Secretary of State is not on the board, frankly the department don't pay attention to the board, which is the issue in certain departments we found. So in my preferred solution, which I accept the problem, is to try and train the Secretary of State how to be a better chairman, frankly.
Thank you for that. Let me take a couple online, really about ministers, this pair of questions. One from Gray MP saying the speakers here keep talking about transparency, but the last thing that ministers want, he suggests, is transparency about their decision-making, for example, the party political dimension to resource allocation. Don't the speakers agree? And another one from Amy saying she agrees with Ian on the lack of system for central strategic planning, but difficult to reconcile this with ministers feeling electorally accountable for their domain only. How do we make cabinet incentivised as a team compared to individuals? Very good point. Thank you. Margaret?
Well, shall I do the transparency?
Absolutely.
All ministers, if you want, or both. Yes.
All just go back with the point with the ministers was what, Bronwen?
The ministers was...
want transparency.
The first one was on transparency.
Yeah, and the second...
Ministers don't want it. And the second one is that ministers feel responsible for their patch.
They don't look across the board.
Two voters, and so how do you get them to act as a cabinet? That they think, that they are accountable to voters for the bit that is in their job title.
Politicians don't want it, but the whole purpose of the Institute for Government is to get more effective, more efficient government. And one of the ways in which you do that is through transparency. And I think if you can, I do look at the local authority model. The local authority model is the advice comes from the bureaucracy to the politicians openly and is debated openly, and then a political decision is taken. I see absolutely no reason whatsoever why we can't mirror that in central government. Absolutely no reason. And what I would argue is if there's greater discourse, you have to do open justification of the position you take, you're bound to get a better end and a more sustainable argument. So I would have advice given to ministers being absolutely open. Now the argument against that is advice then won't be written. It'll be, people will speak to each other and they won't write things down, and that's not very good. And the best is my answer to that is the best is the enemy of the good. It would be better if we took it a little bit further and got that open. On ministers being siloed and thinking only about their department, I think this is completely agree with it, it's a really difficult problem. And when you get some sort of, tough issues that cross departmental boundaries, trying to get real real thinking across the departments to work well is very hard. The only way in which I think you can start to change that is people follow the money. So if you could set up, where there are issues that require across departmental obesity or whatever it is you're thinking about, or actually, I think it's a failure of the health service reforms. They haven't really created those budgets between local authorities and health to really drive the change that we need to deal with social care and reducing hospital care. So I do think the only way to do that, or the most effective and quickest way of doing it, is to force through budgets cooperation across boundaries.
Yeah, if I could add, I think naturally politicians don't sort of see the world the way the world problems show up. They tend to be sort of policy issues led. I thought what Mark Sedwell tried to do with the sort of fusion structure, which is take thematics and work out how they mapped across government, was the right answer, which then creates budget led. But it's very difficult to get the politics to tie up to the government, and this is the sort of constant stress. My other observation about cross-departmental working is that if it's at the right size with the right urgency, actually, I'm going to take a really odd example, but the government had to resolve the situation with Chelsea, which involved DCMS leading it, FCO trying to work out what it meant internationally, and sanctions, and the Treasury trying to work out what it meant for public. Actually, they managed to solve, the three departments worked fantastically well with a bunch of other people, managed to solve a really tricky problem. but because it was bounded and it was urgent, and they actually did a great, we should call it out, it was a great job. But most of the problems that government face are these incredibly messy, systemic, large problems that don't fit our departmental structures, and in fact the departmental structures go in the way. So I think the opportunity to reshape that, but then it requires a strategic plan for government, I'm afraid, which we keep going back to that lack of prioritisation.
Well, I was just going to reflect on a problem case, which is so yes about the risk of silo thinking, but also about ministers not necessarily be interested in long-term planning. We talked about planning for pandemics and emergencies, but of course lots of government decisions are long-term decisions. If you take an example of planning for airport expansion, you can have all the planning in the world and a decision taken under one Prime Minister, and another Prime Minister comes along who doesn't like that decision. And what do you do when you have a long-term plan which is highly political, is obviously about the allocation of resource, and a government or Prime Minister comes in who disagrees with the decision that's been taken? So I don't have the answer to that. And maybe there isn't an answer. Other than, you can have a plan and you can have all the structures you want, but in the end, decisions of that kind are going to be heavily political, and politicians, may want to change them. So I think all you can do is build in the structures to make sure that the best possible decisions are taken, but in the end, they are going to be political decisions.
Democratic.
And Alex, I'm trying to think of. This is a bit unfair. A meeting in which you haven't made the point of how difficult it is for government to deal with these issues that cross departments.
Yes, completely. I mean, on that, just on the sort of political decisions changing things. One of the benefits I would say of a model something like this is it's completely right that ministers take those decisions and are held accountable to Parliament. But it's also really important, and this speaks a little bit to transparency, that it's clear on what basis, on whose advice, how that's worked. So if the sort of bureaucratic state is saying this isn't a very good idea for value for money or other reasons, then I think there's a role for ministerial directions. There's a role for just a sort of more open discussion about the basis on which decisions have been made. On the coordination cross government, I think Ian mentioned the Quad and the coalition period. Really notable, and this was where, if you like, to my mind, the sort of political necessity and the administration combined is that there was a programme for government that was agreed rapidly at the start of the government. It's sort of Ian's strategic plan, if you like. How strategic some of it was, you can debate. But there was both a political and an administrative necessity to agree that plan. It was very hard then for the government to deviate from it, which caused its own problems. But ministers all knew what they were signed up for. The administration knew that was the purpose to support. Budgets could be allocated accordingly. Some of those more kind of wicked cross-departmental problems were started to be tackled. On Andrew's point there about sort of chair of the board, we really went back and forth internally on whether the Prime Minister or another minister or a non-executive or the head of the civil service or somebody else should chair this board. I don't think there is a right answer to it, but I don't think you can divorce the political ministerial authority from the administrative authority in any structure like this.
Bronwen, I just want to come back on the political. I think we've got to be very careful about this. Politicians aren't hopeless at running departments. We've got to decide what sort of politicians we want. And one of my questions today is, people are coming into politics more and more simply to be ministers, simply to do that deeper. And the sort of idea of representing your community or coming in with values, that's sort of going by the board. So I think, just saying you haven't got a particular set of skills, you can be trained to them. You learn on the job, if I'm honest, there's quite a lot as well, and some are better than others. But I'm a bit worried about this, all this political class, they're a bleeding useless lot because they've never run anything. Is that the sort of politician you want?
Really, really good point. Thank you. I'm going to come to questions in the room now while Ian simmers on that one. One there, please.
Thank you. Nick Herbert, I chaired the Commission for Smart Government, which reported last year and which Ian and Margaret were part of. And that was coming up with policy ideas in the same space as the discussion here, but also had a broader purpose, which was to try and create support for the idea that this all matters. Yeah. And that's just what I wanted to try and, if I may, just take us back to, because I thought Lord Sainsbury's introduction was an incredibly sort of powerful, sweeping declaration as to why this all matters, why it should be important. But very quickly, our conversation inevitably gets down into the weeds, into the wiring, because we all in this room and watching are the anoraks who think that these issues are interesting and are important. My concern is that most of Margaret and my and David's political colleagues don't. And even political leaders don't. They don't see that this matters. They don't really want to talk about this. And they're interested in politics. And some of them are interested in policy, not as many as you'd think. But they're not interested in this subject. And I think the prior challenge for us, as Jonathan said, when he referred to the need for political will, as Ian said when he talked about the meta problem, or as Anthony Selden said when he talks about the need for leadership, is how we are going to create the movement that is going to persuade future political leaders of the importance of driving this agenda. And I think it should be possible because it's all about delivery and therefore political success. And because it seems obvious that some of the very big challenges now that have been created by Brexit and by COVID require some major changes that need to be implemented successfully. So we ought to be able to persuade future leaders that this all matters. But I think if we were being self-critical, I think we might agree that we haven't been able to persuade them so far. And I think that's the real challenge for us now. And I think these are all really interesting questions, and I don't mean to dismiss them or to sound patronizing. I have a horrible feeling I might be. But it's just that I worry that we could be sitting here in another 10 years' time, still ourselves talking about these issues and some of the incremental changes that could be made without having really persuaded the political leadership in both major political parties in this country that these really are issues that need to be grappled with.
Thank you very much. You put it beautifully and powerfully. Can I, Penny, you just leave the microphone there. What would be your best example, if you like, or pitch to an incoming Prime Minister for why this matters?
Well, I think I had a go just by saying that I would try and link it to delivery, to say that, what will matter to your political success is not just that you are able to make a series of compelling announcements or appointments, but that actually in a relatively short period of time, you're able to show that things will change. And I think just an appeal to the long term is dangerous because political leaders might find that more of a challenge.
Yes.
I think there has to also be an appeal to the short term.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I will come to another. Let me just take that question on its own there because it is so important, and thank you for putting it. Ian.
Yeah, look, Nick, I mean, as we know, that I found that the single most important question of why doesn't the political will engage on this, given that theoretically we're all here to deliver government. And I think it's David Sainsbury's sort of fear is that we would be talking about this again in another 10 years is absolutely the existential question.
David is nodding, yes.
My sense is that one of the things that we have to do is, and I think your word is right, is creating a movement of we have to go out and sell it. And I think the responsibility for the IfG and for us interested in these things is positively to engage while recognising that it's not the natural interest topic for a lot of people. But to your point, you've got to sell it to a political audience. And so what's in it for them is the key question. And it's making them more effective and more likely to be re-elected is essentially the pitch. And I think we've got to demonstrate that. And I think to do that, we've got to have some models that say, if you do this, it's better for you. And to my mind, that there are lots of ways you can, particularly with the current set of challenges, say to people, look, it's really important that what is seen to deliver is more important than the top-line announcements. And I think that we're in that phase of delivery on this. very, very acute at the moment. Margaret,
Jonathan.
Yeah.
I was going to go to Jonathan next.
Well, really little to add. I mean, I completely agree with the analysis of the problem and with the difficulty of achieving it. But yes, I agree. This is ultimately about the effectiveness of government. And one must assume that most ministers care about that. And it's just persuading them of that link, and this is therefore worth investing in. And I agree, it's not just about the long
problems that this problem has caused.
Yeah.
The merits. Margaret.
I mean, when did Tony Blair say he had the daggers in his back? It was about 6 years in, wasn't it? 7 years in, 8 years in. It was only then that he sort of realised that he hadn't put enough attention to actually the machine and its capability to deliver.
And to throw daggers.
It's impossible. I don't know how you get people to worry about it. I will say this, I've had a lot to do with the civil service, obviously as a minister, and then I had the 5 years as PAC chair. Since 2015, I haven't had a lot to do with the civil service for, for obvious reasons. But recently, ministers have sort of asked me in to talk about the Economic Crime Act. And what has hit me when I've gone in now is how hollowed out the capability is. So in a way, this sort of up and down of recruiting and playing around, it has left us, I hope I'm not offending anybody, but with a lot of young people, you've lost a lot of the middle tier experience that has gone in. This is purely impressionistic.
Yeah.
I haven't been in enough. So in a way, there is an opportunity, perhaps with a new Prime Minister and perhaps with a change of government, to say that actually it is so now, denuded that if if you're going to deliver anything that you care about, this is an opportunity to start building a capability that delivers. So that may be a wrong assessment, but that's literally, I've dealt with about 3 or 4 departments in the last few months, and that's what I've come away feeling.
Thanks very much indeed.
So I think that may be true. I don't want to widen this unduly, but to some of the other sort of constitutional governance issues around the country that IfG and others have been looking at, like ministerial standards and so on, which are not going to happen under this government, but where there are definitely systemic problems, and where, I hope and others hope that, whether under a new Prime Minister or a new government, there will be a moment when these things are thought to be sufficiently important. And I've been at the civil service now a couple of years, but my impression is that morale is not great. I recognise some of the problems you describe, and there is a bit of a running battle. I'm sure it doesn't apply in all parts of the civil service all the time, but the narrative is pretty negative, and you sort of reach the point you can't go on like that. And so I would hope, maybe it's optimistic, but one hopes that there will come a moment where a government does actually recognise this matters, and it has to recognise that it matters to it and its ability to govern effectively, and that would be the moment for implementing some of these otherwise slightly kind of unglamorous reforms, but
Alex,
because they matter.
Alex, would you like to come bring your answer to this question into your final summing up remarks? I want to take 2 more online, which take us in a slightly different direction. One from Christopher Hood. I think he's done a lot of work on the Treasury, saying, how would civil servants working for devolved governments and the administrative operation of those governments fit into a revamped statutory framework? And then he says a little bit later on in our discussion, I still don't know what country we're talking about here. What about civil servants working for governments in Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland? Civil service has had to do without a functioning government for long periods, for the reasons we all know. So there's that one, and then or 2, and then one from Phil Golding, who is Chief Executive of the Law Commission, saying, we've been talking about central government, but David Sainsbury referred to arm's length bodies where often independence is enshrined, there's expertise, maybe more evident, and scale is more manageable. Is there an argument for more devolution from Whitehall to these expert bodies, the Law Commission obviously being one? On which, full disclosure, I'm a non-executive. Who would like to, this takes us out of Westminster, both those questions, the devolved and the arm's length bodies. Who would like to start?
I'll go on ALBs, because I wouldn't want to.
Yes.
Go on nations, I think, is a Yeah, I think the generic principle, I'm sure, applies. That how you do it in different places, I'm sure, is difficult. With arm's length bodies, I mean, I think my sort of concern would be that the same logic ought to apply, in the sense there should be a clear role for the specialists in those, you know, and the civil servants effectively who are in those bodies. Where I think it works well is there's a clear remit for the ALB that is doing something specific. I have to say my experience of seeing the whole variety of ALBs in my time and talking to the non-execs in the ALBs is that there are some sort of very unstructured, unclear ALBs which were essentially kicked out of departments to try and deal with a problem that was perceived at the time. There are quite a few agencies that should never have been separated out. They should have always been involved. So I think the answer is if you've got an ALB with a really clear remit and is clearly set up, it should be able to function on its own, and it should have a version of this type of statute applied to it, I think, exactly logically. The problem I see is where you have the problem of accountability, where it's not clear it's the department, it's the ALB, and there are a lot of muddled places out there which I think make this very, very difficult. So and
what about the independence? Which matters to a lot of them, whether museums,
no, absolutely. Look, I mean,
broadcasting arms.
I was going to say I speak as someone who's got a statutory duty to look after Channel 4, and that might often mean that, you know, that's not necessarily what some parts of government want me to do, but I've got a statutory responsibility which makes it pretty clear. That is incredibly helpful. So to your point earlier, Jonathan, you know, having a statutory base, I think, does make a difference. My concern is just that I think a lot of the ALBs are not necessarily the product of great strategic thinking. I think they are immediate solutions to problems that maybe are a bit archaeological now and have gone away. So I think as part of your general thinking about the civil service, I would step right back and say which parts of these should be where. Some of the LBs are terrific, some I'm less convinced by.
So in answer to Phil Goley's question, should there be more of this to answer some of these problems, you're saying, well, look, watch out, it's got to be for a reason.
Very careful about creating more ALBs.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to go into the devolved nations. I don't know enough about it, but this, somebody said it earlier. There's nothing wrong with a very strong centre and a lot of decentralisation, and that's a good model. But to get it right, you have to you've got to get your regulation and your enforcement and your accountability right. Whether it's ALBs, whatever it is, at the moment we've allowed them to be politicised, something we said at the beginning, which is unhealthy. And then I worry about things like actually the academy school trusts, where the accountability and the regulation is so weak that there's a lot of stuff going on there, which probably, you know, of contracts being given, what's the term? Contracts being given to people with an interest in the particular, and things like that, stuff like that going on, which just shouldn't be. So let's have smaller is better with a strong centre, but then you've got to get regulation, enforcement and accountability much, much tougher. And we never, sorry, another thing, Bronwen, on that. We never invest on that enough. If you look at across the whole thing, it's an area where we fail to invest. So you pass these ruddy laws, you then try and get them enacted, and nobody has ever invested enough in that sort of enforcement accountability structure.
And particularly on the devolved.
Yes, so happy to say that, and I don't know if you want me to do sort of wrapping up moment as well, but on ALBs, just to agree with Ian, Margaret said that I think it's as or even more important that you have a clear model of accountability. I think there is a question about the sort of regulatory state and how it is overseen and held to account. On the DAs, I felt a twinge of guilt because I was going to mention them in my presentation and then didn't. Thought I'd just keep it to UK, but it is very complicated because of the incremental way that the UK civil service has built up. I think there is a way that you would need to work in the leaders of the Scotland and Wales civil service in particular, because if you're going to maintain a single GB civil service. Northern Ireland is a different case. Broadly, the model that we're talking about here is having an opportunity both at ministerial level in Scotland and Wales and civil service level to feed into this board and oversight structure, and then to have accountabilities to the parliaments in Scotland and Wales in a similar way to the UK Parliament. But it's complicated and it's messy, but that's because it's complicated and messy. On the broader points, and I won't say very much more, but I was to Nick, Lord Herbert's fantastic contribution there. Thank you. I obviously agree. I'm not a politician, so don't necessarily know the political answer, but if the last few years has created a moment where the political system, the political class realises that sustained focus on actually making changes happen in the real world to real people is a good thing. The big moments of the big profound political moments, whether it's Brexit or anything else, obviously fundamentally important, but then there needs to be follow-up and needs to be a focus on change. What I hope we've done here, right, wrong, bits of it, more or less suitable, is create a model, create something to have a discussion around and to put out there and to have a debate over what's right and what's wrong. And I think, it's a bit of a technocrat's answer, but having a model to discuss and do some of these things is part of the discussion. So it's not just a kind of
all right, it's beginning to sound like you're summing up, which it isn't yet.
Sorry, I thought I was.
Because we're going to take two more questions in the room, one online as well, and get the panel's last thoughts on that. There are two here on the aisle.
Jess Bowie, Civil Service World. I'm old enough to remember when John Manzoni became Chief Executive of the Civil Service, and he came in with all this fighting talk about how the Francis Maude era, that was the first era of reform, but the second era of reform was that the Civil Service was going to seize its own destiny, whatever the damn politicians thought, his words, and his whole thing was about delivery, improving capability, all the things we've been talking about, reducing churn, creating career paths. And obviously a lot of progress has been made on the functional agenda. But for all that fighting talk back then about civil servants, seizing their own destiny, if it had actually come to pass, would we be having this discussion now? And what do you all think? What's happened to that agenda? Did it die in the water?
Thank you very much for that. John Manzoni would be disconcerted to think you had to be that old to remember coming in. Not that long. And also in front of you, there was a question. And thank you for your patience.
Hi, I'm Ben Ong, work for Sage Group, formerly of the Cabinet Office. Similarly, actually, my experience of driving any kind of change in government required continuity, largely of ministerial support, and I benefited from John and Francis Maude, actually, and Oliver Letwin a great deal. And also the fact that ministers don't need to be, and to the earlier points, ministers don't need to be interested in something to know it's important. And I think we sometimes as civil servants get a bit preoccupied with making them interested rather than making the importance argument. And one observation I would make, it's 4 years since I've left government, is in the private sector and in a large PLC, is the sort of seriousness and sophistication of risk management, which sounds a kind of bureaucratic practice, but just the way that we think about risk and opportunity outside government. And I don't recall ever seeing anything similar in government. And on reflection, many of the issues I think suffered trying to make changes and have seen subsequently were wildly different risk appetites between departments, permanent secretaries, ministers, on fundamentally the same cross-government issues. And I think and maybe a board would be a good way of surfacing those different risk appetites and actually trying to draw some kind of consensus or at least a decision about what the right path forward should be. And just to finish on that, I would say that the risks and strategic risks offer continuity because actually they don't change a great deal. And I do wonder whether or not bringing some of these big risks, whether they're resilience or capability, out would actually survive maybe the churn in ministers and the churn in government. So,
okay, really interesting point. And I'm going to add to that, there's just a final one from online, Stuart Turner, relevantly to these two, saying, do you think awareness and desire for making many of these changes are already there in government and the civil service? If so, why can't they make these improvements themselves? So let's use this to prompt people's last thoughts. Jonathan, may I start with you?
Well, I think if John Manzoni really did quite say that, then he got it wrong, didn't he? Because I think what we're really saying is that you will not make any change of this sort without buy-in from politicians. And that's the conundrum we're wrestling with, really, is how you get the right balance and how you get buy-in. And I mean, he may have been joking, and I knew John well enough to know that that might have been his pitch. And of course, he did help lead changes, particularly on the functional agenda. But in the end, the civil service can't take control of its own destiny without political support. Plainly, we can't legislate without Parliament. Using that as the kind of test example, that was trying to go too far. And what we're now wrestling with, I think, is the reality that in order to do any of this, we will need, of course, we'll need buy-in from the civil service itself, but we will also need political support and ultimately from Parliament. And that's the complexity of what we're trying to do.
Great. Thank you.
Yep. Are we doing wrap up?
We are
Yep.
wrap ups, but beginning with the response to these questions.
Responding to those 2 or 3. I mean, I actually think John and the functional agenda is a long-term mission. I think it has made progress. It's light years on from where I saw it from DWP stages, and then I worked with John at the Cabinet Office. And I think it is a multi-year direction of travel. So, the fact we've had some wins like the legal function, and I think much greater clarity around things like HR than we've had before. It's a sort of slightly never-ending journey, but I think it is still going. And I do think, to the sort of related point, I think quite a lot more of the politicians just sound a bit more glass half full, to your point, do understand the importance. I think the importance interest point is a really good point to make, which is, okay, I know that's important, I'm not terribly interested, but please will you do it, was great. And I think getting enough people into that body of commitment, we don't have to be standard bearers for it, but they have to be supporters because they know it's important, is there. And I think to your final point about risk, I have to say I did spend quite a lot of time in the Cabinet Office Audit Committee looking at risk maps endlessly, and that was not a particularly pleasant experience. And some of them were so infeasibly large, like when the pension deficit between 2 meetings went up by 40 billion on the civil service pension, everyone thought that was quite fine. And I was sitting there with my sort of red alert signs going off. So I think a real risk register, which then implies you've got a strategy, because you can't really have a risk register unless you've got a strategy. So I keep getting back to this, a joined up bit of thinking for the government, particularly on the longer term issues, which might be harder, but they are long term, and it's the duty of the government of the day to think about them with a good risk management framework that is exactly what should be happening. And I think the thing for me is I saw some of that at departmental level, which actually worked quite well. I didn't see it at the government level, and unless it was Jeremy keeping it in his head the whole time, which is probably the way it worked. But that ability to do that in a systemic way, with a real structure to deliver it, I think really is what we have to try and persuade the politicians to buy into.
The politicians.
I think that your thought that we've got to tell them it's important if it's not interesting is really important. And I think if we can take that away today, right. I think that's a really an insight on which we can then try and build a sort of strategy of trying to encourage change. I was thinking of your risk appetite. If I were a civil servant today, I'd be just hope the risk is, are you going to still be there tomorrow? So survival is the risk. But maybe that's me being a bit. And I just want to get back. I worked. It's probably changed massively, but I did work because Tony Blair changed us every year. So I probably worked in, I don't know, 5, 6 different departments. And there were really cultural differences between those departments on those who were totally... It's a different thing about having a risk strategy, but risk-averse culture. And there was a very, very risk-averse culture among too many people. It drove me bonkers quite often, with whom I worked, who really, just as long as they managed to get a bit of paper off their desk and onto somebody else's desk, it didn't really matter whether it led to any progress. So I think there is something culturally among those who work in the civil service, I can't imagine it's changed that much, as to whether on their attitude to risk. And maybe
that's not just risk, Margaret, that's whether it feels real to them. Whether you say it somehow doesn't matter. doesn't
I
seem
just
to
felt
matter at that
what
moment.
I felt, I won't name the departments, but what I just felt was if we had a difficult decision to take or a problem that we were confronting, their answer was simply to put it off for another day, to actually get the bit of paper, or push the bit of paper that they were asking to deal with onto somebody else. Now that's slightly, so if we created a risk management culture within the way that civil service operate, that might bring it out.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just that they were frightened, they just literally, the way in which they managed their careers was by not getting engaged in anything that might have put their head a little bit above the parapet.
Yes.
Thanks, Bronwen. And just on Margaret's point there, I think there's an instinct towards process, which is sometimes absolutely the right thing and necessary. Sometimes it's the wrong thing. So how do you test which mode you need to be in? On those quick points, I mean, John Manzoni played a fantastic role, partly because he could say things like that and had that little bit of distance and different perspective. I think I agree with everything Ian said on the functional agenda. I think there is both on the functions and whether you call them public service agreements or outcome delivery plans or the kind of the way that government sets out its objectives and then holds departments to account for delivering them. I think we're at a moment of jeopardy on that at the moment. So I think one of the things that we and people in this room should be doing is not getting too focused on process, but saying there are kind of important mechanistic ways that the government should work. On Ben's point on importance and interest, completely agree with that. I think there's something, and it goes to what I was saying in my jumping too early on the wrapping up, but the sort of something about the seriousness of government. It doesn't have to be heavy, but it does need to be sort of serious because there are important issues and trading off, which comes back to what I was saying, which is hopefully having a model that allows us to get into some of these discussions is a useful thing. And as I said at the end of my presentation, we want to take that forward with Parliament. We want to take it forward with people who are interested in what the sort of statute or a version of it might particularly look like, and we want to look more at the standards and the functional standards that come from the Cabinet Office and the Treasury that speak to the running of the civil service and the effectiveness of the running of the civil service. So that's a sort of forward-pointing future work.
Well, thank you for taking us to that point. Thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry for the ones I couldn't quite get in. Ben Yong of Durham University, it was a great question. It doesn't quite fit in this session, but speaks to a very interesting course you're doing. Thank you for that. Thank you all. Thank you for engaging with us. Particularly thank you those online who are joining and those from the civil service who've contributed your thoughts about how we can take this forward. And as I said at the beginning, and as David said very eloquently, this is something that we don't intend to go away. And so it's here in printed form and will be a constant theme of our work. Thank you very much. We're going to wrap up this one, and then there is policy making and all the joys of that this afternoon. Thank you. Will you join me in thanking the panel?